All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ronak Patel. I work here at the Municipal Climate Change Action Center as the Energy and Climate Change Advisor. Thank you for joining the webinar today. Today's topic, we're talking about monitoring, measuring, and reporting on climate action. And I'm very pleased to be joined with Michael Hay today from the Town of Banff, who will be giving the case study later on today. But I'm just going to start with some housekeeping as folks start to roll in. So today you're joining us on Microsoft Teams live events. This means you have been automatically muted and your video is turned off. If you do have a question or a comment, you can leave it as a text in the Q&A chat box. I'll just drop a message in there right now for you to all see. But yeah, feel free to submit your questions as we go through the slides today. There is some time allocated at the end towards the questions, so we'll address them at the end of the hour here. I'll also note that we're recording this webinar for reference later on, so you'll receive that as part of the follow-up from this event. I wanted to start by acknowledging that this presentation is being presented to you from Treaty 6 territory here in Edmonton, as well as Treaty 7 territory in Banff, where Michael is. We want to acknowledge all the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries, and whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant communities. There might be some folks on the call today that aren't familiar with the Action Center. If you are new to us, we were founded back in 2009 as a collaborative initiative between the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association, the Rural Municipalities of Alberta, as well as the Government of Alberta. And we provide funding, technical assistance, and education to support Alberta municipalities in addressing climate change. So for today, I'm gonna start by talking about the Partners for Climate Protection Program, just a little bit overview of that. And then I'll jump into the bulk of today's topic around monitoring, measuring, and reporting. And then we'll be joined by Michael Hay to kind of review what the Town of Banff is doing with their climate action plan. And then, as I mentioned, we'll take the questions towards the end, so do leave those in the chat as we go. So the delivery of this webinar is made possible through the Partners for Climate Protection Program. The PCP program provides a 5 milestone framework to help municipal governments take action on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The program itself is a joint initiative between the Federation of Canadian Municipalities as well as ICLEI Canada, and it's the Canadian component of ICLEI's Cities for Climate Protection, or CCP, international network. Here in Alberta, the Action Center supports member municipalities as the regional climate advisor. So as I mentioned, there are five milestones in the framework. You can see them all out here today, and they're really to support municipalities having long-lasting action on climate change. Today, we're really going to cover milestone 5. If you do want to learn more about the first 4 milestones, I've done a couple of webinars throughout the year on them, so I can refer you back to those. And of course, I'm available to talk one-on-one if you want to dive into some details. But yeah, today is all about milestone 5. So what are we doing in milestone 5? We're monitoring progress and reporting on results. So breaking down what that means when we say monitoring progress, this is really about understanding the results of our emission reduction actions that we've planned for in milestone 3 and how they've been implemented, which was milestone 4. We're also talking about reporting results, and what this really means is creating a way to document the progress. And that's useful for both internal purposes as well as external stakeholder engagement. So that kind of leads into, why do we want to monitor progress? There's really 3 main questions we're trying to address. We want to be able to determine if we're going to meet our emission reduction targets, if our individual reduction measures are producing the anticipated results we thought they would, and if this is not the case, if our actions are not producing the results that we thought we would, or if our target is not, if we're not on track to meet our targets, can we use the data that we've collected to evaluate and adjust accordingly? So to help answer those questions, I've outlined a couple of tips and suggestions that come from working with members in the program, all about monitoring, measuring, and reporting. The first tip is really to spend time and track the results of your specific emission reduction measures. So here I'm talking about individual actions. We want to be able to track the results of these specific actions if they involve. What this involves is quantifying the reduction. So if we're reducing energy consumption or maybe waste generated, we want to quantify that amount and then take that and calculate the quantity of emissions, of greenhouse gas emissions that were avoided from that action. So just as a little example, we might be able to determine the difference between a facility's energy consumption before and after some sort of energy efficiency retrofit. And this allows us to understand that energy reduction as well as calculate the emissions that were avoided. When we are tracking specific measures, we can measure the emissions, but we can also take some time to track some of the co-benefits or other pros that are involved with this type of initiative. So we probably want to assess our implementation costs. This will give us a good understanding of the return on investment and payback period, more of the financial overview of what the measure involves. We can track some of the co-benefits, like what is that reduced costs? Are we creating jobs? Are we improving the local air quality or just the general population, the general community health? So we want to try and track. So this tip is all about tracking specific individual actions that are part of your plan. The second tip is more overall. So we want to try and update the inventory. So this is really important because it allows us to determine whether or not we're on track to meet our municipal, community, or corporate emission reduction targets. So similar to the example of our building with the energy efficiency retrofits, an updated inventory can be compared to the baseline inventory to assess performance across the whole scale in emission reduction. So we want to try and update the inventory periodically. The suggestion that comes from the PCP program is to update your inventory every 3 to 5 years, somewhere in that range. And this is really given to kind of create time, ensure that there is adequate time to refine your plan if needed. So this really builds upon that first tip. So it's really important to track specific actions. It's a valuable exercise to determine how effective they are, both for emissions or financial or the other benefits. But updating the inventory allows us to account for some outside factors that aren't included in that individual scale. So things like population growth, economic development, changes in legislation, or just general behavior change of your citizens impact your emissions profile, and the inventory can help highlight that. The 3 to 5 years is just a suggestion from the program. I would also kind of point you in a direction of finding out, what works for you. As well as understanding your data collection options and trying to streamline that to make sure you have a very smooth update. One big thing to note from dealing with members here is you want to make sure that you use the same data collection method to update your inventory that you use to create your inventory. So we really want to make sure that we spend time and ensure that there is consistency between the methodologies between the years, because that helps with the accuracy of your inventory, which is a big aspect of the inventory. The third tip focuses on engagement. So as you do the planning, or if you've completed the planning, you've engaged with local stakeholders and decision makers. So likewise, we want to go back to them and communicate the results of our actions. So you can consider using various public awareness campaigns, social media, online engagements, and communication strategies to connect with diverse stakeholders. This is especially true in our COVID situation, where communication is a little bit different this year. So we are trying to focus on making sure people are aware of what's happening in their community. I'd also suggest that you try and connect with both the residents, but also the business or industries that exist in your community for both your corporate work and your community work. The community work, a pretty clear connection. Everyone wants to know how the actions that they're doing are impacting the community. That's really important to report back on with your stakeholders. But the corporate inventory is also important because it can show the internal work of what's happening at your municipality. It can demonstrate climate leadership, various aspects that are important to both citizens as well as businesses. The fourth tip is about documentation, and it connects to that engagement tip as well. It's really important to have good documentation that connects to that external stakeholder engagement, really creating opportunities for your municipality to share its story. But then climate action updates and progress reports can also support some of your internal requirements. Might just be for your general project monitoring, it might be for a grant that you have to report back onto, or it might just be for council updates, letting leadership know what's happening as the plan progresses. So really reporting to your stakeholders provides them the results of the processes of which they've contributed to. It's also important because it can help you build support for future initiatives if you're able to show how some of your work has completed over time. For municipalities that are members of the PCP program, part of the commitment is to report on your activities back to FCM for them to track as well. So those were a couple tips, and to kind of tie them together, I really want to spend some time talking about how this work is really about continuous improvement. And I think this is the PCP logo kind of hints at this. It's very circular in nature. If you're able to reach your emission reduction target, if you're able to complete parts of your plan or even just a initiative, those are all significant achievements. So it's important to take time and reflect on the progress that you've made and celebrate that success. But it's also important to know that emission reductions don't end here. So whether it's setting a new target, striving for one that's a bit deeper in terms of emission reductions, if it's working on updating your emissions inventory to replace it as a baseline condition for your new plan, or just continuing on to the next initiative, it's really important to kind of think about how to build that momentum. If you have completed a milestone 5 and you want to think about going through this process again, the PCP program can also support your continued progress through the renewal of the milestone achievements. Okay, so for PCP members, reporting to FCM ensures consistency among members and creates, it gives them information to create reporting nationwide. So you can see these annual updates through the National Measures Report. It highlights a couple of case studies as well as corporate initiatives from municipalities, as well as more of the community-wide initiatives. So you can see the latest version of the National Measures Report on the FCM website. Here in Alberta, there have been a couple of municipalities that have gone through and achieved Milestone 5, which has pretty much verified their work to monitor progress and report on results. The cities of Calgary, Edmonton, Spruce Grove, and St. Albert have all completed corporate scale Milestone 5 completions. And then the city of Spruce Grove and St. Albert also have community scale emissions. You can see case studies on all of these municipalities on the MCCAC website under our PCP resources. So have a look there as well. And I also wanted to share a couple of relevant resources. This webinar is kind of a summary of information shared in all 3 of them. The first one is a blog post from the Action Center on today's topic, monitoring, measuring, and reporting on climate action. There's also a guidebook from PCP specifically for Milestone 5, as well as the PCP protocol, which is our overall guiding document. In the appendix, there is a list of what's needed for reporting. And you can view, again, all 3 of these can be viewed on mccac.ca under our blog or under the PCP webpage resources. Looking at the attendee list today, I know there's a couple of municipalities that are working on their Milestone 5 submission. So this is what is actually needed to submit to FCM for your Milestone 5. You need to submit an updated corporate or community inventory for the current or near current year. You need to be able to quantify the greenhouse gas reduction impact of each of your measures in your plan, as well as report on how stakeholders and other decision makers have been included through the process. So hopefully you can see how some of the tips that I gave today can help build your requirements out and really give a good submission to FCM. So we're gonna switch over to Michael. I'll let you cue that, Michael. And as you do switch control, maybe I'll just give the folks a little bit of a bio to introduce you. So as manager of the environment and sustainability, Michael leads the Town of Banff's work on the implementation of their environmental master plan, a comprehensive and courageous roadmap for a sustainable future for both the residents and visitors to Banff and the ecosystems in which they live and interact. So with that, we'll just cue Michael's slides here. I'll help you out here a little bit.
Thanks, Ron.
And thanks, Michael.
So I can't see myself, but I'm assuming everyone can see and hear me. Can you just confirm that for me, Ron?
Yeah, it looks good here.
Awesome, great. And if you wouldn't mind muting yourself as well, I'm getting a bit of an echo there. That'd be super. And I think there's a question already as well. So feel free to, it's on transportation emissions. So if you want to bring that up again, Ron, when I get to some transportation stuff in a few slides, that'd be okay too.
Yeah, sure. I'll cue you when it matches when you're talking about it.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. Thank you everybody for being here. I'm sure a number of you have other things on your mind with COVID-19 being the way it is these days, and I really appreciate you tuning in to listen to Ronick and me. My name is Michael Hay. I'm the Manager of Environment and Sustainability at the Town of Banff. I've been doing this job for only a little over a year, actually, although I worked for the Town of Banff as a consultant for 2 or 3 years prior to that. And one of the most interesting projects I've had a chance to work on is actually managing our climate action plan, the development of our climate action plan in 2018 and 2019. So I guess I know a few things about this, but there's no such thing as an expert on climate action planning, and hopefully some of you will reach out to me and let me know your thoughts and maybe trade a few good ideas here. This is, I think, less of a case study, as Ron described it, and more of a shotgun blast of things I think are important when trying to implement a climate action plan and monitoring progress. I also want to give a shout out to Sally Biddlecombe, who is our new municipal energy coordinator with the Town of Banff. Her face is probably turning red right now as I talk. She's been a fantastic addition to the Town of Banff's environment team. I really think energy management is at the core of climate action, as well, in particular, measuring and reporting on progress. So thanks to Sally for her help with this presentation. So I'll just go through very quickly the outline here. I'll tell folks a little bit about the Town of Banff. I think probably just about everyone has been here, unless you're tuning in internationally, but I think there are a few things that people aren't actually aware of. Town of Banff has some unique characteristics. Then I'll get into our climate action plan in not very much detail, just some general descriptions, high level numbers. But then I'll get right into our community emissions tracking and what I think are some of the key things to remember. Specifically, focusing on the 3 focus areas in our climate action plan, which is the built environment, transportation, and waste, of course. And then my darling and Sally's darling, corporate emissions monitoring, where we have lots and lots of data. We can actually get things done on the ground and manage projects and directly quantify emissions reductions that we can control. And I think that's very exciting as well. And then a few takeaways at the end. Yeah, I think, as I say, everybody's probably been to the Town of Banff. Of course, we're located in Banff National Park. We're actually sitting on lands that we lease from the federal government. I think we pay a $500,000 lease payment every year or something like that. So we don't actually own the land. The town is actually very young. It's only 30 years old, incorporated in 1990, jointly by the federal and provincial governments. I think we're the only municipality in Canada that has a joint incorporation structure of this kind. We're pretty small from a permanent population perspective, just around 9,000 people, but that doesn't belie the fact that we actually have a summer peak population of somewhere in the neighborhood of 60,000 in a good year. Obviously, we didn't hit that this year. our average annual visitor adjusted population is somewhere in the range of 30,000. So our infrastructure, our roads, our water services, waste management, snow plows, waste collection, all that stuff is all sized for something rather larger than our permanent population would suggest. Just some quick numbers from our climate action plan. We're consuming about 5 million gigajoules per year of energy. About 2/3 of that is transportation, actually, and emitting about 425,000 tons per year. Our emissions intensity per capita is actually quite a lot higher than most other municipalities. That's simply because of all the tourism. Every permanent resident in Banff gets burdened with the emissions of every tourist. So, we invite people here, our economy benefits from tourism, so we have to take our licks when it comes to emissions. Of course, we have a pretty strong environmental mandate being in Banff National Park, and that goes all the way up to the federal legislation that dictates Parks Canada's role in the park and in turn the Town of Banff's role in the park. Crucially, we are responsible for conducting ourselves according to the principles of no net negative environmental impact, or 3NEI. Sometimes you don't hear about this much in the media, but that's kind of the underlying principle in the national park, is that if we do damage in one place, we have to make up for it somewhere else. And generally speaking, we're always trying to improve. So it's more of always have a net positive impact. And I think this is probably most clearly expressed in the simple fact that we have a fixed development footprint in the town of Banff. So 3.93 square kilometers, it's not going to get any bigger unless there's a federal act of parliament to, for some reason, expand the town. So that's obviously a huge help when it comes to emissions. We don't have to worry about new subdivisions popping up, but it's also a big challenge because we have to achieve a lot in a town that is very dense and has very little flexibility. So it is a bit of a challenge in that respect. So a bit on our climate action plan. It was adopted last year, actually, just a year ago in December 2019, after about a year and a half of work. And our horizon is 2050. So we're looking at 80% reduction by 2050 and a 30% reduction by 2030. And our corporate emissions target is actually a little more aggressive at 50% by 2030. I think actually, based on some of the work I'll show later and that we're continuing to do, that we'll be able to beat that. The scope of our study, like most community climate action plans, is the town within the town boundary. But uniquely in Banff, we have these proximate outlying areas that kind of stretch out into the park where we still provide basic services like wastewater, water services, waste collection, transit, things like that. So a lot of those areas are included in this as well. Everybody knows these places. It's the Hot Springs, the Rimrock Hotel, Rocky Mountain Resort, Juniper Hotel, Cave and Basin, places like that. We're looking at the full scope here with buildings, transportation, and waste, although we're not looking at scope 3 emissions, for those of you that are familiar with that. So we're not looking at air travel from East Asia or the Europe or anything like that. It's a scope 1 and scope 2 study for the most part. And of course, we're looking at the entire community. So specifically, according to the Global Protocol for Greenhouse Gas Emissions for municipalities, this qualifies as a basic inventory rather than a basic plus inventory. This is just a quick pie chart snapshot of our emissions, energy and emissions against those same two numbers, 5 million gigajoules, 425,000 tons. And you can see the contribution of transportation here. There's a bit more detail shown on these charts than is actually colored. But the blue is transportation, the green is buildings, and the tan or yellow is waste. So, in a typical municipality that isn't so tourism focused, it might be more, a third transportation or a quarter transportation. The other thing that's interesting about Banff is we don't have any industry or agriculture, so we don't have emissions from those kind of operations. So what are we actually doing? Well, we have a low carbon scenario, like most climate action plans, which describes how we're going to get to our target. And that low carbon scenario consists of 30 actions organized into 4 focus areas. And those 4 focus areas are energy efficient buildings, local low carbon energy, so not just renewables, but sources that are lower carbon than the grid. So cogeneration, for example, would fit under B. Importing renewable energy. This is one that we thought about a lot, but it's a bit challenging to make progress on. We're talking about things like corporate PPAs, purchasing renewable energy credits, buying green gas through your natural gas service, green power, bullfrog power, all that kind of stuff. But we're trying to think as big as we can. Corporate PPAs are very much on our mind these days. And of course, low carbon transportation, being the elephant in the room really for us. And this suite of 30 actions does get us to our target, but obviously the whole point of this webinar today is about monitoring and measuring and reporting and seeing if you are really realistically going to get there, and trying to track that. So yeah, we will see. We're in year 1 right now. Most people are probably familiar with seeing a wedge analysis chart like this. This is how low carbon scenarios are typically presented. You can basically see all the different wedges here. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but you subtract from your business as usual scenario, and hopefully you get down to your target. I actually prefer something a bit more like this. I find these wedge charts a bit, I don't know, busy and not very instructive. What I actually prefer is waterfall charts. This one's a bit simpler. It doesn't have every action in it. It actually has 4 decreases here, each of which corresponds to one of those 4 focus areas, into which all those actions have been grouped. And on the left here is our emissions and the sources of those emissions, and then, well, in 2016 and then in 2050. The corollary to that chart from an energy standpoint is this chart here, and you can see that it's kind of an inverse. We're sort of trying to reduce emissions here, but here we're trying to increase the amount of renewable energy. So that's why it's kind of flipped around. So this is our energy mix today, and anything below this line, if you can see my cursor, is fossil fuels, and anything above that line that's shaded in green, that's renewables. So right now we have, basically next to 0 renewables for all intents and purposes, and our plan in theory will get us to pretty close to half and half by 2050. I think there'll be people who are listening in who are thinking, oh, why don't you go for 100% renewable energy? And then there are people who'll be saying, well, this is crazy. You're not going to get anywhere near what you've targeted here. So it's, yeah, of course, everybody has a different take on what's achievable, and we're all going to find out together. Oh, and I'll just do credit here. The idea for this chart was borrowed from the city of Vancouver. They have a nice pamphlet out on their climate action plan that looks very similar to this.
Michael, sorry, before you go too far, I think there's a question that pertains to a couple slides here.
Sure.
Just asking if around the baseline year, so is 2016 or 2019 the baseline year for which the 2030, 2050 targets are being compared to?
Yeah, thanks for that. Sorry, I missed that. Our baseline year is 2016. So when we did the data gathering for our climate action plan, that was in the fall of 2018. And at that point, the most recent complete data set we had was from 2016. The other important reason we chose 2016 is because that is a federal census year, and that provides us with some, rock solid data on some aspects of the community. But yeah, from an implementation perspective, given that the plan was only completed and adopted by council in December of 2019, 2020 is year 1 of implementation. Does that answer that, Ron?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks.
Yep. So as I mentioned, we don't have really any industry. I think we have a couple of breweries and a distillery, but aside from that, we don't really have any manufacturing. And we obviously don't have any agriculture. There's no farmland in Banff National Park. So we can actually, in the town of Banff, we have the luxury of basically being able to look at, these key sources of energy plus our waste. And that gets us virtually all of our emissions if we do the modeling correctly. So, just going through these in order of, quality and accessibility and reliability. Definitely natural gas, it's a breeze. We've got really, really good data from ATCO. I'll go into that in a little bit. Electricity is pretty good too. We've got good data, but there are some hiccups and some uncertainties around emissions factors and things like that that you have to watch out for. So it's nearly as good. Waste is a bit dicey. We have good numbers for tonnages, but you have to figure out and estimate a lot of the emissions factors for various waste streams. And you sometimes don't know where all your waste is going as well. So it can be a bit of a headache. And then transportation, of course, is a bit of a nightmare getting all that sorted out. So this is sort of, I'm going to go through these in order of difficulty. So for natural gas, as I said, it's pretty wonderful what we've been able to get from ATCO. We just send an email to them every year, and they send us monthly consumption for the community, organized by rate code. So we can update everything annually very, very easily. We can track our natural gas consumption annually and do that by rate code. So commercial versus residential versus multifamily customers, for example. And actually, when we do greenhouse gas, when we did the greenhouse gas inventory, and I think when we update it in 2023 or 2024, we've been able to pay ATCO a little bit of money, a few $1,000s, just basically for their time to dive into that data in more detail and give us monthly consumption organized by rate code, but also by geographic area. So we can break the town down into geographic chunks. And then that actually enables some pretty detailed analysis. So for example, this is the area south of the river, the large commercial customers south of the river. There's only 6 of them. And this is just a energy versus heating degree days plot. And that allows us to separate space heating loads from domestic hot water based loads, just in a very simple way, of course, which is pretty fantastic to be able to have that level of detail for a pretty significant source of emissions. So using that data, we can start to think about what kind of initiatives in the community might have the greatest impact on emissions. So I'd encourage you guys to reach out to your natural gas distribution company, whether it's ATCO or someone else, and just see what kind of data you can get if you haven't already. And oh yeah, I did make a note here also that there are confidentiality limits here. So ATCO can only provide data that's aggregated up to a certain point. So they won't give you, one customer's data. It has to be a certain number of customers cobbled together. But in most communities, there are 2 or 3 big users that are consuming a big amount of emissions, and you know who those are. And often they'll be cooperative, or rather not cooperative, but they'll be willing to share their data with you. So by all means, reach out to them. From an electricity perspective, it's a little harder. We get that similar monthly data by rate code from Fortis, but we really haven't had much luck getting better data from them. I'm not sure why. It doesn't really matter. It's not that big of a deal, but when we combine it with our natural gas data, you can actually see in Banff, our long-term gas plus electricity trend is really stable. And part of that is just by virtue of the fact that the community isn't growing, but is also related to quite a number of programs in the town, our environmental rebate program, our solar PV rebate program, and just a general hard work by a lot of stakeholders and commercial operators to manage their energy consumption. So it's a good story. It's really good if you can start from a fairly stable baseline like this, fairly stable historic baseline when you're looking at decreasing emissions. One huge thing that most people will be aware of, but I would be remiss if I didn't emphasize, is that the emissions of the Alberta Grid are something we have to track very carefully. And this is really all about adding renewables to the grid and phasing out coal. So most of this decline is the transition from coal to combined cycle natural gas plants on the Alberta Grid. And once most of that is done, then it's going to get a lot harder to get any lower than 300 or 400 grams per kilowatt hour. But you want to maintain this, and every time you take a look at your numbers, think about check in that national inventory report, which is available, I think, on the government website, and get the latest numbers. And of course, this will become more important over time, because if we're going to be electrifying transport and electrifying heating, then electricity is going to be a much bigger factor in our emissions. The other thing is in your community, I imagine there's some communities on here, some of which come to mind that are making really big strides on the solar front, or that have big industrial emitters that are switching over to cogeneration, things like that. Those communities, I think you really want to try and work with those commercial partners to try and get data on, how big their projects are, what are those projects producing. It can have a pretty big impact on your community's emissions as well. In Banff, we have had fantastic success in the last decade, especially since 2015, with a growth from basically 0 solar to over a megawatt of solar, and that's about 50 or 55 projects now we have in the town of Banff. So it keeps growing. We've got more and more coming, and such that we've actually now are able to generate 1% of the community's electricity through solar. Which doesn't sound like a lot, but when the grid only has 10% renewables on it, you're adding sort of 10% to the total renewables mix in your community. So that's a great success story for us anyway. Something coming up these days is corporate PPAs. So a lot of large corporations and probably some municipalities fairly soon will be entering into these long-term agreements with renewable energy producers, and that will have that's the kind of deal that with the stroke of a pen can have a major impact on the community's emissions. So watch out for corporate PPAs that might be affecting your community. Power purchase agreements, just in case I was throwing too many acronyms there. One thing we're thinking about lately is to keep track of all these things. You don't want to have to reach out to every single stakeholder in the community. It would be great if there was a registry for green projects, a website essentially that residents and businesses could log on and enter their projects in, and then you'd have some free data to work with. We'll see if we get that up in the next year or so. Waste is a little harder, of course. In Banff, it's not quite as hard as it could be because we actually manage all waste collection. A lot of municipalities hire out or have an open business market for waste collection, but in Banff we have control over that, so we know where all of our waste goes, and we don't have to go around asking for data. One thing that popped into my mind is that if you are having trouble getting access to the waste collection data from commercial operators, conceivably you could pass a bylaw that says if you're going to be a commercial waste operator in our community, you have to provide us with your numbers, how much waste you collected. That's just a thought that popped into my mind. But a big one is trade waste, and in Banff, I forget the number, but it's close to 40 or 50% of our total waste is actually construction, renovation, and demolition waste by mass, that is. So we're lucky because, again, most of that we know it goes to the Francis Cook landfill in Exshaw. But if you're in the middle of the prairies, that waste could be going in all directions. So good to know where all of your trade waste is going, as best you can anyway. So yeah, transportation emissions are a huge challenge. You really have to work with whatever data you can find. In our case, we got right into our greenhouse gas emissions inventory before we really realized we were missing some key data. So we had to make do, and I imagine that's the case for other municipalities as well. Just because you've had to go through that doesn't mean it's you can't collect more data. Right now, we're talking a lot about collecting some new data, which I'll mention in a second. What we built our inventory on was a couple of things. We're lucky we have entrance data from the national park gates. We also have traffic counters at our 2 highway entrances. It's another nice thing about Banff is it's basically only 2 ways to get into town, so it's easy to count cars. Retail fuel sales data from the retail gas stations in town. You can actually buy this from commercial data companies. They will actually sell this data to you for a few $100s. It's not a big expense. It's only part of the story because who knows where everybody's buying their gas, but it's part of it. We also get card lock fuel sales. This is for commercial vehicles from Parks Canada, and we have another operator in town that provides that as well. Something that's really useful for us in Banff is we conduct municipal censuses every 4 or 5 years. And we were going to do one this year, but we didn't do it for COVID-19 reasons. But we don't just collect population data there. We actually ask people things like, how do you get to work? How do you get to work in the summer? How do you get to work in the winter? Things like that. And anybody who's done a climate action plan knows that mode share is a key input and a key output. So that data can be very handy. The piece that is missing for us, and probably for a lot of others, is an origin destination matrix. So this is just a table where along the X and the Y axis you have, or on the left you have all of the various potential destinations that people are going to when they leave town, and all of those along the horizontal on the top, all the same places because that's where people could be coming from. And then that basically counts up the number of trips back and forth between each destination. So hence origin destination matrix. This is really, really valuable. It keeps coming up when we do studies, and we just haven't got one yet. So at some point we're going to probably go to the effort to get this, but it is a lot of work to get. For us, when we did our transportation modeling, we used the induced activity method, which normally requires an origin destination matrix, but we had enough other data that we sort of cobbled together enough data to do that. Basically what this induced activity method means is any trips that occur totally within town, but also basically anybody who's traveling from Calgary, for example, Banff gets 50% of the emissions of that trip, and Calgary gets 50% of the emissions for that trip. Again, we're asking people to come here, so we have to take responsibility for some of those emissions. Okay, home stretch here, corporate emissions. This is...
Sorry, Michael, before you transition to the next slide, I think
Sure.
this is a good time to ask the question that came in earlier about vehicles. So I'll just read the question out. The question reads, there are so many extra uses of vehicles in our auto-centric societies. Are you just measuring all of this with vehicles, or are you just measuring tailpipe emissions?
Yeah, and the short answer there is tailpipe emissions, and it is just tailpipe emissions, but I just wanted to qualify that a little bit. I'm anticipating a little bit of what's behind that question. I'm thinking about the construction of roads, the construction and maintenance of roads, upstream emissions associated with oil extraction and refining, diesel extraction and refining, things like that. And I think the upstream emissions are probably taken care of because those are usually under the companies or the refineries that are moving those fuels. But in terms of road construction and road maintenance and other infrastructure required for vehicles, parking structures and things like that, yeah, we're definitely missing a lot of those emissions. You might call those embodied emissions, or the embodied energy in building that infrastructure. So that's something that we all need to work on, is figuring out whether we want to include that in our inventories. In Banff's case, we did a basic inventory, which doesn't include most scope 3 emissions, but a basic plus inventory would include a lot of those emissions, I think. So yeah, I guess it depends on the level of detail you're able to achieve in your inventory.
Yeah, thanks. I think that really kind of hits home the idea of understanding the different scopes of what we're measuring. A comment came in, I guess maybe clarifying, it's not just trips, it's roads, parking, road cleaning, clearing, etc. So it's kind of, you touched on that as well, but if you use the GPC protocol, if you use the PCP protocol, the scopes are defined. I think in a perfect world, all emissions are accounted for by the right party. But then there are cases where emissions get missed, or in some cases emissions get double counted. So it kind of just points to the idea that we do need to have robust scoping done.
Yeah, and just one last thing there. So snow plowing and road grading, things like that, just day-to-day road maintenance, that is captured in our inventory because that's our fleet vehicles that do that. But if you are, for example, contracting that work out to a third party snowplow company, for example, then you might not be capturing those emissions because maybe that company isn't based in your municipality. Maybe they're based somewhere else, or maybe you just haven't asked them for their fuel consumption data. So yeah, that's sort of segues to this corporate emissions. So we definitely include fleet fuel emissions in our corporate emissions. They're not in the charts I'm going to show you here. We usually track them separately. But obviously you need to maintain good records for gas and electricity. Every single facility, you've got to monitor every facility, every vehicle, every piece of equipment. And then for me personally, I'm very deadline driven. I need the pressure of a report to motivate me to do work sometimes. So yeah, get that reporting commitment in. For us, we report annually to council. We have a facilities energy and emissions report that we give to council mid-year. We usually give it in June because it takes a few months for that last December set of utility bills to reconcile and be finalized. So we usually start preparation for that in late April, early May, and then present in June. which is usually a good time for council. Interested in these things in the summer, I find. Also, it's worth putting some thought into how you actually want to kind of market, or not market, but categorize and explain things. For us, we have a tier system for our facilities, so tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. When people hear tier 1 facility, they know we're talking about the Fenlands Rec Center, the wastewater treatment plant, our water wells. When they hear tier 2, they know we're thinking about the big municipal admin buildings. When we're talking about tier 3 or tier 4, it's usually about some small little facility off in the corner of town. So it's useful to have that. To manage all that data, I mentioned earlier, it's very much an energy management problem. So energy management software is very useful for that. We use RetScreen. There are a number of other options. Sally took this snapshot, I guess it was earlier today or yesterday. And you can see I think this is the Fenlands. Yeah, it's our big rec center, and you see she's highlighted some key events here that are helping her track changes in energy consumption over time. So I strongly encourage you to try and build some of that capacity in-house, or get a nice reliable consultant to help you out with it. I said that waterfalls are my baby, and that's absolutely true. I have a bit of an oil and gas background, and we used them a lot there when we were talking about reserve additions and things like that. They're very valuable from a climate action perspective as well. I think I want to make a couple comments here. Yeah. In particular, you want to. The benefit of a waterfall chart is it puts everything on one piece of paper, and it forces you to think about, is that block too big? Is that block too small? You need to apply scrutiny to every single one of these, because it really helps you visualize the contribution. It's one thing to say, oh, I want to build a solar array. It's another thing to say, how much does this actually get me towards this finish line? So waterfall charts I find they're really valuable. Just a couple things to finish up on here. I wanted to highlight some recent challenges that we've had with emissions. Maybe some of you are having similar challenges. We have a district heating project. I'll show you a couple of photos at the very end here. That's in the middle of construction. It's almost done, actually. It will be fueled by a bunch of waste wood from our transfer yard that we're chipping and burning in a boiler. What's tricky about that is, what is the emissions factor that you should assign to these wood chips when you factor in that some of them are from pallets, some of them are from fire smart debris and fire smart material that we've cut down. Some of it is from construction, renovation, and demolition waste. Some of it's just, Joe Blow chops a tree down and needs somewhere to send it, so he sends it to us. So there's a whole mix of sources. How do we assign an appropriate emissions factor to that? We also have, a few challenges with co-metered buildings, figuring out how to separate those key systems and those key buildings so that you understand your consumption as best as you can. And then solar, like as I said, we have so much solar, but there are two aspects to solar production. One is self-generation, where you're using that solar on site, but then when you no longer need that power, it starts exporting the power to the grid. And those really should have and do have two different emissions intensity factors. So tracking self-generation versus grid or exported energy is really important, and often arrays don't have that capability. So yeah, a few takeaways, a couple things I addressed already. Definitely, it's important to identify the gaps in your data. Just because you've completed an inventory and you've got lots of beautiful charts and you've presented it and you've got it on your website, it doesn't mean that you're done collecting data. Every inventory can be made better. So definitely continue working on collecting data. For us, it's that origin destination matrix. I think that's our next big step. From my perspective, climate action is very much an energy management challenge. Waste is huge, of course, but purely from an emissions standpoint, waste is usually only a fairly small fraction of a community's emissions. To really make progress, it's all about energy. So try and build some capacity for energy management in your office. It's also important to be very honest. I think a lot of the time we get very focused on reducing emissions, which is great, but we forget about all the places where we're increasing emissions, where we're seeing some slippage. It's important to get those tracked as well. That can be as simple as, more people are in a building, so it uses more energy from lighting and heating, and maybe people are driving to work more because you've got more staff, things like that. And the other thing is, stick to a reporting schedule. You definitely want to get that message repetition with council and with the directors. You want to get people used to seeing this data it takes a few years, I think, to really get people warmed up to the idea that this is something that doesn't only need to be done, it's just something that we do. We track our emissions. So we want it to become normal. Just wanted to finish with a couple of photos. These are just from this week. Probably our most exciting renewable energy project right now is our biomass district heating project. This is a project that'll burn about 200 tons of wood waste from our compound, and it will heat actually the four largest buildings in our compound as well, including a new net zero carbon transit garage that we're building for Rome Transit to house electric buses. So there's a whole bunch of projects kind of merging around this one biomass project, and we're getting very close. So there's some district heating lines there in the ground on the left, and then the building just going up and almost being done on the right. So that's just for fun. Thanks a lot.
Great, thanks a lot, Michael. I know the Town of Banff is a bit of a unique municipality, but I'm sure some of the work that you've done and struggles that you face are common among other municipal staff and climate action practitioners. So I'm sure they found it very useful.
I hope so. Yep.
There are a couple of questions to follow up with, and maybe we'll have a bit of time here, so we'll leave it open for folks to submit their questions as we go. So 2 questions here from Larry. I'll ask you them one, and then I'll give the other one after you answer. So it's around the solar. Are the solar installations all microgen, or are some selling directly to the grid?
Yeah, great question. They're all microgen, actually, in our case. So I think our largest project is a 280 kilowatt array on the Fenlands Rec Center, but even that one is microgen. It's a ice facility, so it has pretty high electricity consumption. So that array actually generates, I think, only about 20% of that building's annual electricity consumption. But it still exports a lot of power because it's, we don't have hockey in the summer for the most part. So most of the power is generated in the summer. So we export a lot of power, but that's under the microgeneration legislation rather than small scale.
Perfect. So all microgen, which ties in well to Larry's next question. Is the town doing anything to incentivize residents to install microgen on their buildings, like I guess homes or shops and stuff?
Yeah, definitely. So this is not, I'm not the one who claimed this, but I'll repeat the claim. Apparently we were actually the first municipality in Canada to offer a feed-in tariff solar PV incentive. And that was back in 2015. So in 2015 and 2016, when we had, I think, 15 or 20 solar projects go up in town, and those were all incentivized through a feed-in tariff. So it was 50 cents per kilowatt hour or something like that. Then we changed the program over in 2017 to just a straight upfront rebate. So right now we offer a 75 cent per watt upfront rebate up to a maximum of, I think, $5,500 for any solar array. So yeah, we have a fairly well subscribed solar PV incentive program. It basically pays for about a quarter to a third of the cost of an array. And right now, I'll just throw out that we've had pretty good residential participation in that program in the last 5 years, but fairly lukewarm commercial participation. So one of my goals in the next couple of months is to go back to council and ask for a bit of additional money, hopefully, to boost commercial participation. Basically, we're looking for larger arrays. We want to see that graph get steeper quicker. So.
Yeah, that's a great rebate. Definitely covers a good portion for folks in Banff. I guess we'll wait a little bit for some questions to come in. Maybe I'll just quickly plug on the screen there is a QR code for the evaluation of this webinar. It gets sent directly to FCM, so it definitely helps us out if you can let them know what you thought of today's event, if there's any topics you want to see covered in future events. And I'll also post a link in the chat as well. Oh, and I see there is a question here from Andreas. For you, Michael, what types of actions is Banff considering to reduce transportation emissions?
Yeah, a lot of things. So we have, first of all, there's a lot of things that we do and we have been doing for quite a long while. So if you look at regional, or rather bus transit. So bus transit is probably our main one. Transit started in the Bow Valley, I think in 2008 or 2007. And I've worked with those numbers a fair bit, and it's amazing the amount of growth that there has been in transit since then. So I think maybe 4 years ago, there were about a dozen buses operating through the Bow Valley, most of which are centered in Banff. Now there's 26 buses in the Bow Valley. There's, I think, ridership is about 1.25 million per year. So bus transit was identified in our transportation master plan a couple of years ago as a top priority. We also have a lot of active transportation initiatives. We go so far in our environmental rebate program to offer rebates on studded tires for bicycles. So that's been a very popular program. We've even offered yak tracks rebates because we want people to feel safe walking on the streets in the winter, things like that. But yeah, I mean, we've got a lot of work to do in terms of changing how we bring people to the park, because everybody drives or flies to get to Calgary, of course. And there are a lot of interesting things coming. Most people are aware probably of the proposal to reinstate a passenger train from the Calgary airport and from downtown Calgary. So that's a possibility. And obviously with Rome Transit growing, we're seeing a lot more public transit to and from Lake Louise, as well as from Canmore. I lived in Canmore for about 6 months, and I took the bus from Canmore every day. It was very nice, actually. And then the other thing is, in the last few years, we've introduced On It, which is basically operated by Rome Transit. It's just a big, pretty green bus that transports people from Calgary out. Service on the On It bus is probably going to grow over time, I think, and stretch into the weeks. I think into the weekdays. Right now, it's mainly weekends. But COVID-19 has introduced a real wild card into all this, because public transit obviously is seen as a riskier form of transportation. So we're very, very keen to see a vaccine for COVID-19, because not only has COVID had a huge impact on the economy locally, being tourism driven, but it's impacted our environmental goals, because people don't want to take the bus when they're going to get sick potentially. So.
Great. I know I've taken the bus between Canmore and Banff, so I'm very glad there are options that exist locally there. Not seeing any other new questions. There's a little bit of time left. I guess I can talk a little bit about, there is an upcoming event for PCP members. I do run a community of practice for all the members and staff. The meeting is coming up on December 10th, so if you are a PCP member, you can join this closed group meeting, and I just kind of lead a facilitated discussion on based on a survey of topics that you want to hear about. You should have received an invite through the PCP newsletter, again for the members only, but I can follow up directly as well if you are interested in attending that. Yeah, no new questions that came in, so I'll just take a couple minutes here to just thank everyone for attending today for the hour. A special thank you to you, Michael, for joining as our guest.
My pleasure.
And yeah, I'll send a follow-up email with the recording and another link to the evaluation survey shortly, but that's all we have for today. Great. Awesome. Take care, everyone.